We hear a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, these days, with major pension funds like Calvert aligning their portfolios with them, and up to $12 trillion in finance, by one estimate, ready to do the same. But what are the Sustainable Development Goals? That's a question I tried answering almost 3 years ago, way back in June of 2016, when the SDGs were just a few months old, and I was just beginning to fiddle with this podcast. I hadn't yet mastered the art of audio production, so today's episode is cringeworthy from that standpoint because it's an encore presentation of that 2016 episode. If you're a patron, you will not be charged for today's show, but if you're not a patron, I encourage you to become one at bionic-planet.com or at patreon.com/bionicplanet. In 2006, a non-profit organization called World Vision started helping people in Ethiopia plant trees, because trees slow climate change by inhaling the world's most common greenhouse gas, namely carbon dioxide, and exhaling oxygen. But World Vision is not an environmental group. It's a humanitarian aid organization, and it planted those trees to help poor rural communities earn money by helping companies reduce their carbon footprints, by essentially making it possible for those companies to lock their greenhouse gas emissions in trees. The plan worked environmentally and socially, and the Soto Reforestation Project, as it's called, is now pulling 22,000 tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year. That's enough to offset 22,000 round-trip airplane flights between Chicago and Berlin. Socially, it's generating 2,000 jobs, while the trees have also captured water and pushed it into the ground, enough of it to replenish 12 springs. And they've injected enough nitrogen into the soil to ratchet up fertility for about 80% of the farms. As a result, families that had been getting by on just 2 meals a day are now eating 3 square. Last year, 9 years after the Soto Reforestation Project began, the United Nations came up with 17 so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which, among other things, guide the lending strategies of massive financing institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund through the year 2030. 150 world leaders signed off on the SDGs, and some companies are using them as a sort of global business plan.
My ideal goal will be that everybody will run its business plan and its objectives along the Sustainable Development Goals, that we would actually publish our annual reports to show what contributions we make to the Sustainable Development Goals.
That's Paul Pullman, the famously green CEO of food giant Unilever, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland earlier this year. We'll hear more from him in a bit, but first, here's something really interesting. Shortly after all these world leaders agreed on these Sustainable Development Goals, in other words, when the goals were still fresh and new, an environmental consultancy called CO2OL drew up a list of all the benefits that the Soto Reforestation Project had already generated over the past decade, and they laid them side by side with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are essentially future aspirations. You know what they found? They found that this decade-year-old carbon project already fulfilled 11 of the 17 spanking new Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in the grand scheme of things, offsetting 22,000 transatlantic round trips isn't going to fix the climate mess. But there are literally hundreds of these projects scattered around the world, according to the most recent Ecosystem Marketplace report on forest carbon finance. Some of them are saving endangered forests, and others are planting trees, like this one. But all of them are mopping up carbon dioxide, while most of them are selling offsets to raise money to help poor rural communities adapt to climate change. But here's something else a lot of them have in common. Many of these projects are struggling to break even, while, at the same time, investors are looking to put their money into endeavors that align with these Sustainable Development Goals. Let's go back to Davos, where Paul Pullman was speaking. UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon was there too, and he had just come from an event called the World Future Energy Summit. It was held in Abu Dhabi, in one of the world's most oil-rich countries, and it focused on the economy of tomorrow, the decarbonized economy, the one without oil. They had a video link to high schools all over the world.
One group of high school in Somalia is working on solar panels. By video, one of the young student, pointed to a grassy area. She said, I quote, "This is where I will put the solar panels, and it is where my future begins." It was quite moving. On that patch of grass, you see the link between climate and development.
Moving, yes. But that Somali schoolyard isn't the only place where you see the link between climate and development.
Around the world, more and more people understand that climate resilience supports progress. Trillions of dollars will be invested in infrastructure in the coming years.
Trillions of dollars. Today on Bionic Planet, the link between climate change, sustainable development, and carbon trading. How Ethiopian farmers, European investors, and all of us can avoid getting completely whacked by climate change and maybe even come out ahead if we learn to navigate the new reality of life on a managed planet.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth. We broke it, we own it, and nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature itself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a new podcast of the Anthropocene, the modern epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we hear one way that these Sustainable Development Goals fit into this equation.
Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief.
That's a recording of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. It's from 1963, the year he was assassinated, and he's talking about peace. But he may as well have been talking about climate change, which is why I'm using him to open a segment that we call
We'll Always Have Paris.
We'll Always Have Paris, as in the Paris Climate Agreement, which went from hero to zero in the minds of many because it doesn't magically turn us all into selfless tree huggers. Kennedy delivered this speech at the American University 7 weeks before signing the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. He signed that treaty in August of 1963, 9 months after the United States and Soviet Union almost went to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was just 1 day shy of the 18th anniversary of the day the U.S. dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. Nuclear proliferation was the climate change of its day, and I learned of this particular speech because of a guy named Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist who helped Poland and a bunch of other countries navigate their way out of communism and into functioning economies. Today, he teaches sustainable development at Columbia University, and he offers a lot of his courses online for free. They're excellent, by the way. He called his article Why the Sustainable Development Goals Matter, and in it he described the Limited Test Ban Treaty, or LTBT, as, quote, a landmark agreement to slow the Cold War arms race that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. And it was. It happened in part because, well, to be blunt, both countries sort of crapped their pants after Cuba, and they recognized the need to work together. Though the LTBT certainly did not end the Cold War, he writes, it provided proof that negotiation and agreement were possible and laid the groundwork for future pacts. Now, back to Kennedy.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man.
Kennedy was not an enemy of hopes and dreams. After all, he weaved them himself and got us to the moon 5 years after his death. But in this speech, he warns against the danger of embracing magical thinking, and he implores us all to
focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions.
Based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution of human institutions.
On a series of concrete actions and effective agreements, which are in the interests of all concerned.
A series of concrete actions and effective agreements, which are in the interests of all concerned. The Paris Agreement isn't perfect, and it isn't neat and tidy like the Kyoto Protocol was. But that's one reason the Kyoto Protocol failed. The Paris Agreement is complex and often appears nebulous, but it's also a workable, all-encompassing bundle of thousands of individual agreements hammered out through decades of scientific research and political negotiation, and it interconnects with thousands of other agreements and national laws. It isn't just a, quote, small step in the right direction, as the writer Naomi Klein described it, but rather a comprehensive framework within which we can now take the giant steps that are needed. But Sachs didn't cite Kennedy's speech for the passages I just highlighted. Instead, he cited it for something the president said about the role of goals, like the Strategic Development Goals, in galvanizing public support for complex initiatives like nuclear disarmament and the Paris Agreement.
By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it.
That's what the SDGs do. There are 17 of them, and they include things like ending poverty, ensuring good education, and building pipes, bridges, roads, and floodplains that will work in a changing climate. Basically, it's stuff you can't argue with. But how do you get there? First, by breaking the broad goals down into specific targets. And the SDGs are broken down into 169 of those, and each of them has billions of dollars in financing attached to it. Goal 13, for example, is the one dealing with climate change, and it delineates 5 specific goals, from integrating climate change into national policies to helping people understand the science, but it also explicitly recognizes the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, as the primary vehicle for fixing this mess. And the UNFCCC has about 1 million financing mechanisms embedded in it.
Leaving the phase of negotiations behind. This is a new era of collaboration. The whole world is united in its commitment to the global goals embodied in the Paris Agreement, as well as to the means by which to achieve them.
That's Christiana Figueres, the Costa Rican diplomat who has steered the UNFCCC since July of 2010. She's stepping down this summer, but she was still in charge at last month's climate talks in Bonn, where she told reporters to essentially hold onto their hats.
The press used to ask me for many years, why is this going so slowly? And I think we're now going to have to get ready for a new question coming from the press is, why is it going so quickly?
While the Kyoto Protocol made people feel good because it offered clear emission reduction targets, it provided no means of achieving them. And those means that did work, namely the flexible mechanisms like carbon trading, were often dismissed by purists as being imperfect. The Paris Agreement, on the other hand, offers global agreement on 1 million ways of getting things done, and it automatically adjusts to get more things done, while the SDGs offer a kind of overarching benchmarking apparatus.
With the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, you have opened the opportunity to meet the climate change challenge to a great extent by fulfilling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
The Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement fit together like yin and yang, and there are 1 million other initiatives that fit into this effort as well.
It is very clear that also from Paris, that although it's goal 13 and we talk about the other 16 goals, the reality is that probably more than half, I say probably 13 or 14 of the goals have climate change written into them. If you look at the goals of forestry or oceans or the development goals, the partnership, I would even say the goal number 16 of fragile states, etc. So climate change permeates the whole sustainable development goals, and that makes it easier, I think, to link it now quite actively and fast to the SDGs.
The energy system is already changing, and fast. More than 50 coal companies have gone bust in the last 3 years, while solar and wind projects are spreading around the world, from the United Arab Emirates to the southwestern United States to the villages of Somalia. But our planet's living ecosystems, our forests, farms, fields, oceans, streams, lakes, and rivers, they're a mess. Even if we end all industrial greenhouse gas emissions today, we're looking at 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degree Fahrenheit average increases in global temperatures, and that will wreak havoc on our agricultural systems. On top of that, if people don't have sustainable livelihoods, they'll be forced to farm unsustainably, as Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg made clear, also in Davos.
If we don't reach the SDGs, if we don't manage this, it will not be possible. Because then a lot of countries will look for cutting down forests, and not doing the investments in decarbonizing their economy, because it will mean losing jobs. So we have to find alternative ways of creating those jobs.
Let's get even more specific. Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, is the largest producer of cocoa.
But I would say that the production eats a lot of forest.
That's Daniel Duncan, Prime Minister of Côte d'Ivoire, explaining the challenge of growing cacao, the tree that gives us cocoa. It's a ravenous plant that sucks nutrients out of the soil if you grow it densely or without the right nutrients. And cash-strapped farmers often have no choice but to do just that if they're to feed their families. And, as a result, they end up chopping more virgin forest. But the question, says Duncan, is
how to do so that we'll not cut the forest in Côte d'Ivoire. We have to have an agriculture which should be friendly, I would say, with the environment. Well, in that case, we have to use more fertilizer, to use less land, to use more irrigation, and mechanization. If you do that, we can have the same production within lesser land in Côte d'Ivoire. That is not for cocoa, but for all the agriculture. We have a program called the five-year agriculture program of about $4 billion US. 60% will be contribution from the private sector. And Mr. Paulman of Unilever are contributing to the private sector financing.
So, to save forests, Côte d'Ivoire, like Indonesia, like Brazil, and like scores of other tropical countries, has to overhaul its agricultural system, and it's tapping private sector money to do so. And that brings us back where we started, Ethiopia's soda reforestation project. I learned of it through an article called Emissions Reduced, Lives Saved, New Metrics for the New Normal, which my guest Ali Goldstein wrote for Ecosystem Marketplace. You can find the article at ecosystemmarketplace.com/articles/SDGs or SDGs. Ali has spent the better part of the past year speaking with companies that use voluntary carbon markets to reduce their carbon footprints. And she also talked to people who develop these carbon projects because she wanted to understand their views on non-carbon co-benefits, which are all those community and biodiversity benefits, the jobs, the improved soil fertility, the replenished wells, the restored habitat, etc., the stuff that brought groups like World Vision into the carbon markets. In theory, projects that generate lots of co-benefits should attract higher prices from buyers, and she wanted to see if that's happening or not. She published her findings in a report called Not So Niche, Co-Benefits at the Intersection of Forest Carbon and Sustainable Development, which you can find at that link I mentioned before, the one at ecosystemmarketplace.com/articles/SDGs or SDGs. Unfortunately, she couldn't really say for sure whether or not high co-benefits translate into high prices. But she did find that co-benefits are hard to pitch, for lack of a better word, because there aren't many globally agreed on benchmarks beyond carbon standards. The SDGs, it turns out, might just change that. In describing the soda reforestation project, she talked about an impact report, and I asked her first to tell me what that was exactly.
What the project is marketing and selling mainly is the carbon emission reductions, which are measured in units of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. But so that is what has to be measured by, a third-party auditor that goes with the project. So the impact report sought to kind of go beyond that. Most forest carbon projects also aim to deliver other social and environmental benefits. So the impact report meant to quantify those and present them in a way that was understandable to a company that was potentially investing in the project. So this one actually went household to household to survey people about the project impacts, which was, a very on-the-ground and in-depth approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Why do developers focus on co-benefits?
It's often because actually achieving the climate impact is not possible without also achieving sustainable development. So for many projects, the two really go hand in hand. And philosophically, the reason we want to achieve a stable climate is, so people everywhere can have a good life. It's kind of a chicken or the egg. You kind of can't have one without the other.
Yeah, and I guess what I find really interesting in these projects is how what people in the carbon world call a co-benefit is so often how the carbon is generated. If you're dealing with people who, say they're being forced to deforest because they don't have other sources of income, and then you come along with a carbon project that provides other sources of income or helps them commercialize their farms more effectively, that then takes the pressure off the forest. I mean, so you have these projects that where in some ways the carbon is almost a byproduct, right?
Right. I mean, some people actually oppose the term co-benefits because, the things that fall into the category of the co are, land tenure reform, indigenous people's rights, food security. So, I mean, they're co in the sense that they're, I guess, co to the ton of carbon, which is the typical unit of transaction on the carbon market. But, they're certainly not co or secondary in the context of those communities and also, most people's goals about why they're involved in the carbon market in the first place.
And there's always been this this sense on the part of project developers that offsets generated by projects that have a lot of co-benefits should attract a higher premium because they're actually providing more. They should attract a higher price when they go to sell them. And your findings are that this isn't happening. Is that correct?
Yeah, the findings are that essentially that we couldn't detect a clear price premium. So carbon is not really a commodity in that the prices really vary transaction to transaction. They're based on, a negotiation between a buyer and a seller. And I think there's just kind of a lot of noise in the data in terms of the main factor, I guess, that we've found affecting prices is really the size of the transaction. So, for instance, a red project might deliver a lot of amazing co-benefits, but it avoids deforestation over, sometimes hundreds of thousands of hectares. So projects are able to verify and transact 500,000 or 1 million tons of emissions reductions a year. So just that volume means that they can offer lower prices and, still get enough capital in some cases to actually implement those activities. Whereas a tree planting project, it takes time for trees to grow, and the payoff in terms of the emissions reductions is often smaller, unless the project is really, really massive. And tree planting projects do typically sell offsets at higher prices. So we often see differences across project types and across kind of project size, and that kind of obscures what we might call a price premium, if that makes sense.
So the value of these co-benefits, it could be a lot higher.
I think the value is captured by the fact that, companies like Disney and Microsoft and the Dutch Post and all of these major private sector buyers, they wouldn't be involved at all in the carbon markets if it weren't for the co-benefits that projects delivered. So, it's very difficult to put, a number or a percentage on it, but a large portion of the, almost $5 billion that have been that have changed hands in the voluntary carbon market over the years is due to the fact that projects do have benefits other than climate protection.
But how are these co-benefits generally quantified?
Well, they're quantified in different ways, I guess. The report that Ecosystem Marketplace just put out called Not So Niche kind of goes into this in detail, but there are a few different standards that forest carbon project developers use that provide a framework for verifying co-benefits. So some of the main ones are the Gold Standard and Plan Vivo, which both embed co-benefits into the carbon offset. There's the Verified Carbon Standard, which is purely a carbon standard, but it's often used in conjunction with the climate, community, and biodiversity standards, which provide a framework for social and environmental safeguards. And there's a few others. So the Fair Trade Climate Standard, for instance, just launched in December 2015. So there's lots of innovation in this space. So far, our conclusion was sort of that most co-benefit standards provide a framework for how to measure, but they're not going to necessarily specify which metrics to use. There are certain principles, for instance, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, that you have to, actively engage a community that's going to be impacted or involved in the project, that kind of cut across all of the standards. But part of what the report did was to ask project developers themselves what they were able to, what co-benefits they were able to actually measure and how they did that. So some were fairly straightforward, such as jobs, how many people you employ. That's something that most project developers track. When it came to other impacts, such as climate adaptation, for instance, or even biodiversity. A lot of project developers, they might do a biodiversity survey and observe which endangered or threatened species appear in the project area, but there's not necessarily sort of decided upon metrics that all projects use.
Okay, and is it accurate to say that the Sustainable Development Goals then are kind of creating this sort of standardization?
A bit, yeah. So as far as I know, there's something like 169 SDG indicators, and project developers are starting to look at those and say, hey, we already measure some of this stuff, and perhaps if we frame what we're already doing in terms of the SDGs, the attention around the both public and private sector finance that will flow towards achieving those 17 global goals, that could be advantageous to us.
Ellie Goldstein, Senior Carbon Associate at Ecosystem Marketplace and author of the report Not So Niche, Co-Benefits at the Intersection of Forest Carbon and Sustainable Development. You can learn more about her findings at ecosystemmarketplace.com/articles/SDGs or SDGs. You're listening to Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, or whichever service you use to access us. And give us a good, honest review, because the better reviews we get, the more ears we get. And the more ears we get, the more understanding we can spread. If enough people listen, we might even get some funding. And that's important too, because right now, Bionic Planet has none. It's a labor of love. And I'm both the labor and the love. It's written by me, produced by me, and distributed by me, albeit drawing on content we've created at Ecosystem Marketplace. If you want to offer feedback, or even better, advertise on Bionic Planet, reach out to me directly at steve@bionic-planet.com. Once again, that's steve@bionic-planet.com. You can also help us financially by clicking on the support button at bionic-planet.com. That about wraps up this edition of Bionic Planet, but first a few parting thoughts from Paul Pullman.
The cost of this is $2 to $3 trillion a year just to implement the SDG agenda. ODA is $140 million. Some other pledges that are made. It cannot happen if we don't unlock the enormous amounts of money in the private sector. And the private sector also understands increasingly more so that there is no business case in enduring poverty, that they have to get involved.
But where is that money going to come from?
If women in this world have the same rights as men, the calculations are that the global economy would be $37 trillion bigger. If the energy situation, hopefully sustainable energy situation, would be given to all the people, that's $18 trillion. If we give the people decent homing with urbanization, the population growth, the cities that we need to build, those are investments of $90 trillion. And the way we do this is going to decide how we're going to live in the future. So we'll put a lot of emphasis on making this business case a case of opportunity, and many businesses are starting to understand that.
We are in a period of tremendous upheaval and change brings opportunity. That means winners and losers, but it also means innocent victims, and that's what we need to guard against. We won't get through this mess with an every man for himself mentality, but we also won't get through it with slogans and bromides alone. If we properly navigate our way through the next 5 years, then the opportunities of the ensuing decades will come to those who provide solutions that are fair and equitable. And in the coming months, we'll meet people who are trying to do just that. I hope you keep listening, and I apologize for the erratic production schedule and maybe the funky background noise you heard today because I'm recording from my noisy apartment in Chicago. I'll have another episode tomorrow, and then another in a week or two. After that, we'll try to be more regular. Until next time, I'm your host, Steve Zwick. Thanks for listening.